So one of my earliest memories of Brigida, the little heretic, or the dissenting nonconformist, tends to surface around this time of year. You see, every year on the 4th of July, the subdivision across the street from my childhood home had this very big red, white, and blue patriotic parade to celebrate America, the quote, land of the free and home of the brave. But that particular year, I was a 4th grader, and I had just learned about the ethnic cleansing and forced displacement of thousands of indigenous people and tribes, which the Cherokee people call the Trail of Tears. So while walking to the parade, in tow behind my mother, I asked her some very big questions. Questions like, why are we celebrating freedom when we know that not everyone is or was free? I didn't like any answers. So I sat on the curb, arms crossed and folded, refusing to wave a flag. And despite my love for chocolate, I engaged in what might have been my first act of resistance, because I refused to take any candy from that 4th of July parade. So today, looking out at all of you, I find myself in pretty good company, because our faith is one that has never shied away from prophetic critique. You see, our theologically pluralist religion of Unitarian Universalism comes from 2 denominations of Christian heretics. There is the heresy of universalism that said no one, yes, we mean it, no one is condemned to eternal torment in hell. All are saved. And then there was the heresy of Unitarianism, which said God is not made of 3 ways. There is no Trinity. Instead, there is a oneness and a unity, for God is in all. But I personally really like the way that 19th century minister Thomas Starr King captured the heretical roots of our faith. Starr King said that Universalists believed that God was too good to damn them, and Unitarians believed that they were too good to be damned. Sounds familiar, yeah? So yes, Unitarian Universalism, we are a proud heretical tradition. The earliest etymologies of the ancient Greek words for heresy and heretic originated from the Hellenistic Roman schools of philosophy, and those words originally meant to choose or choice. And our religion is often self-described as a chosen faith, for we are neither a chosen people nor a people whose choices are made by religious creeds. For a long time, we have prided ourselves on being the people who choose. But later on, the word heresy came to mean sect, or in Christianity, heresy began to signify dissenting sects, dissenters from Christian orthodoxy and doctrines. At a General Assembly conference, researcher Kimberly Hampton, may she rest in peace and power, she reminded me that there's this fallacy tucked into our heretical history, that the very narrative that UUism prides itself on is that our religious ancestors gave their life energies for a freedom of belief, the freedom to choose. But in many ways, using the word heretic is also UU's adopting the language of our oppressors. Because for our ancestors, being labeled a heretic was not a term of prideful self-definition, but instead a label forced upon them as a violent act of repression with severe and often very deadly consequences. So I think it's important that we remind ourselves that our UU ancestors were radical reformers. Radical because they engaged in the risky business of not just theological deconstruction, which is critiquing systems that firmly state what one does not believe, but they also engaged in theological reconstruction by asking what is possible and being able to name what we do believe, not just what we don't. So for me, the transformative and healing power of Unitarian Universalism does not come from being a faith story about a heretical people who choose. For me, the power of our faith comes from being a story about a people willing to ask what's possible, a people who know that embracing possibility is not just about belief or having faith, it's also about gathering power. Exercising choice in the free and responsible search for truth and meaning, this has been a core tenet of our faith. And yet, beloveds, I also think there is something deeper, something more transformative underneath that theological value we hold. Something that can bond us beyond our shared antipathy toward rejected beliefs. Because behind any act of heretical dissent is a spirit of revolt. A spirit of revolt that dares to make a big ask. What could be possible in our world? One of the biggest heretical heroes of our faith is a Spanish physician and theologian named Michael Servetus. And Servetus is celebrated as one of the earliest shapers of Unitarianism as a religious movement in Europe. In most historical tellings, UUs have claimed Servetus as our very own Unitarian martyr for religious freedom. And I get it, because as a heretical heritage, stories of persecution have become critical in our self-definition as being a chosen faith. But I want something more from the stories we tell about our past, because these stories also shape our present. So this left me wondering, where in the story of Servetus, where in our martyrdom memories, is there the liberatory charge to be the spiritual revolutionaries that we need for this time? And that's when I found it. Historian of Christianity and church history, Dr. Albert Hernandez, tells the life of our Unitarian martyr, Michael Servetus, as being one about a spirit-led revolutionary, well ahead of his time with very progressive ideas about the church. Servetus was born in 1509 or 1511 in Spain, and he lived during the time of the High Renaissance and Protestant Reformation periods in Europe. As a boy, the sacred Christian doctrine of the Holy Trinity, that the divine nature is one God who exists as three distinct persons, the Creator, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, this really troubled Servetus as a young one, because he could not find any direct statement in any sacred text to support this in his studies. So he printed his anti-Trinitarian views in 1531, and he also printed a heavy critique of both the Roman Catholic and Protestant clergy for the lingering corruption happening all around him. Systems that Servetus saw had been in operation since the rise of Christianity coincided with the rise of Roman Emperor Constantine. And for his writings, Servetus was quickly denounced by both the Catholics and the Protestants, and the sale of his book was prohibited. But Servetus' spirit of revolt continued. He printed another book that incensed the Spanish Catholics so much that they recruited his brother, a Catholic priest, to locate him and bring him back to trial for heresy. Wanted by both Protestants and Catholics, Servetus adopted a new name, and he went underground for 2 decades. In Paris, he studied medicine, and he's credited with the European discovery of pulmonary circulation. But even as a physician, he never stopped making that big dare. He never stopped writing theological essays that said, listen, the marriage of the church and state, this doctrine of the unity too, this deeply offends God. Servetus wrote another book under a pseudonym outlining his radical idea to restore Christianity. This is what he thought. He was adamant that God's external manifestation came in the form of a Bible, but it was God's internal manifestation that lived in the hearts and minds of all beings through a divine spirit. And for him, It was the power of the divine spirit that refuses to ignore any corruption or oppression in our world. The power of the divine spirit that creatively asks us to reimagine more free and more just worlds. Spirits of revolt know that liberation doesn't come from a God who is someplace else, because God is us. But spiritualities of revolt are very transgressive and subversive, because just like Servetus did in his writing, they directly engage in the passionate act of not waiting to be liberated, but instead taking an active position of being responsible for creating the world that we want to live in today. Under his alternative name, Servetus started writing to a French theologian and Protestant reformer named John Calvin. And after receiving a copy of Servetus's latest book, Calvin discovered this writer he was corresponding with must have been that wanted heretic Servetus. And so he gave the Roman Catholic Inquisition all the necessary documents to put Servetus on trial for heresy again. And after being arrested, Servetus escaped from prison, but he was later spotted and arrested again in Geneva. And it was there that Calvin became his accuser, and Servetus was found guilty of spreading heresy, and he was condemned to be burned at the stake. And he was burned alive with copies of his books tied to his thighs. After the execution, Calvin wrote a book to defend himself against what he called the Servatian plague of anti-Trinitarianism, and then so many rebuttal books came out that were published calling for the church to be more religiously tolerant. And Servetus's death became a symbol of the rigid authoritarianism under Calvin, and the seeds of Unitarianism in Europe were planted. I believe that Servetus's story, his story about his revolt spirituality, someone who dared to ask what's possible again and again, is a theological resource for our time. I believe that our heretical ancestors gave us more than a religious tradition about freedom of choice. They also gave us a liberatory faith, one that is imaginative in its creative impulse to not only dismantle legacies of dehumanizing injustices, but also dare to birth something more new and more free. So, beloveds, if we are going to continue to claim to be the heretical faith in these next chapters of our story, then today we are called to dissent. We are called to dissent against any oppressive system that is strangling us today. And if we're going to take seriously this liberatory charge, we also need to grow and cultivate spirits of revolt, a revolt spirituality that emboldens us to unapologetically assert the theological self-worth, because all of existence is whole, both in our sanctuary walls and beyond them. So I ask you this big question. Where is the Unitarian Universalist spirit of revolt daring you to speak now? Daring you, daring us to ask what's possible, even when our hearts are weary and the world around us looks so very broken. Spirits of revolt, call me to join the dissent. Call me to speak now. Speaking now to dissent against the decisions that uphold Speaking now to dissent against decisions that uphold systematic racial inequalities in its reversals of affirmative action. Speaking now to dissent against decisions that are widening the racial wealth gap by blocking relief for student loan debt, disproportionately burdening our Black and Hispanic borrowers. And speaking now to dissent against decisions that perpetuate hateful discrimination by making it legal for businesses to refuse services to queer folks. And speak now to dissent against any form of state-sanctioned violence that upholds the legacy of unintentional martyrdom that happens every single day to our Black and brown beloveds and our transgender kin. As we process together the continued erosion of justice in our country, my prayer is that we listen, and speak now. Let us listen to the words of abolitionist activist Mara Mikaba. Let this radicalize you rather than lead you to despair. I believe that we can trust our holy rage. We can invite in a spirit of revolt to activate our individual and collective bodies to dissent. So perhaps the chosen part of our faith is that we believe there is no one right way to embody a revolt spirituality. That a revolt spirituality embraces possibilities, dares to turn social conventions upside down, sides with love, and refuses to accept nothing less than freedom and nothing less than justice. As a people of possibility, when we come together, our acts of faith are not just about believing a more liberated world is possible, but co-creating it in the here and the now. I also believe that spirituality as a revolt can mobilize our religion beyond its least common denominator that is bonded over the heresies of what we don't believe in. Because when we dare to ask what's possible, we become more deeply cemented in our highest values as a people of faith. The values of faith that views obstacles as invitations for innovation, where we get to reimagine and reinvent ourselves and the world we live in to be more free. Innovations that honor my fourth grade self, the little heretic in me, the one who cringed at those patriotic parades, by making a conscious choice decades later to honor and listen to that spirit of revolt inside me. So this year, I've decided to move beyond my dissent of the federal holiday and inviting my spirit of revolt to reimagine it. So this Independence Day, I will be celebrating Interdependence Day. How heretical of me! And I do this because as a people of possibility, we hear the cries of the world. The cries of the world asking us to not only choose what we believe in, but also how we choose to be together. That none of us travels down this road of possibility alone. So will you and your spirits of revolt join me? If so, I want to see your flags of interdependence, the ones you made today. Wave them high and wave them proud. Wonderful. And when the road we are traveling down gets bumpy, may we remember that love will guide us. And beloveds, together, we can change the world with our love. Happy Interdependence Day. May it be so.